One other topic that you brought up that I really wanted to talk to you about today was also performance. I know you've done so much work in sports performance. You mentioned the research being done in ketogenic diets with sports performance, especially as it pertains to very high glycolytic type sports. You know, I know you've worked with rugby athletes in the past. We tend to think of those activities as such high heart rate, burning primarily glucose as the fuel source. What is the research borne out as far as reducing the carbohydrates in the diet to be very, very low to a ketogenic level for those types of athletes that are also doing that high end type of exercise?
Yeah, so it is interesting because there's been the publication of several studies in the high intensity space that has looked at, so high intensity HIIT, high intensity interval training, very glycolytic, which means utilizing glucose as a fuel source, coming through glycolysis. And the studies that have been done well in that they've fat adapted athletes for a lengthy period of time, so 4 weeks plus, so to make sure that they're fully fat adapted, and they've compared them to high carb athletes. And several of these studies have actually found that while the ketogenic diet doesn't necessarily improve performance relative to the high carb athletes, it's not decreasing performance either. And I think that message is a very important message, because every second athlete that I talk to has got gut issues. And when you got gut issues, there's a carbohydrate food quality kind of link there, and they just do better on a lower carbohydrate diet. So I think that we need to, you know, I know the kind of gold medalists just go high performance at all costs, gold medals at all costs, but I think we can't separate health from performance. And actually that's moving in positive directions in the high performance sports space. There's health is on the menu, which is great. And I think that when you take into consideration the health of the athlete, you'll find that there are lots of athletes that can fare very, very well on low carb or ketogenic diets when they're doing glycolytic activity. Absolutely. So again, it can go horribly wrong if you change your diet 2 weeks before you've got a CrossFit competition. You know, you wouldn't do it like that. You do it sensibly. You would fat adapt, and you might even fat adapt and not stay fat adapt. Or no, you will stay fat adapted, but not stay on the ketogenic diet forever. But bring more carbohydrates in some training sessions that are more glycolytic and just are a bit sort of higher intense, that have a high intensity, and you just need a little bit more nutrition support in the form of carbohydrate. So that carbohydrate cycling thing, or that protocol, which is not actually, it's not actually grounded in evidence, because it just hasn't been tested, because it's, you know, how do you do that really? But it's that trial and error. If you fat adapt an athlete, you make them metabolically flexible, and then play around with carbohydrate, particularly if they're the glycolytic athlete, there should be no reason why an athlete can't fare very well, if not even better, because they're feeling better, and they're not performing with gut ache.
Yeah. I notice that all the time. I noticed it with myself when I was a cyclist, and if you're not fueling all the time, quote unquote fueling, I was eating, cookies, double chocolate cookies in the middle of rides, because like if you're not taking on carbohydrate during the ride, you run out of the carbohydrate. There's so little that we store, it runs out very quickly. And I remember just these long bike rides where my gut just hurt, my stomach would just be aching, and it just, you knew that's what you had to do at the time. And you mentioned the gut issues. I think also, the mental thing that we've talked about. What about athletes that are talking about, anxiety and performance anxiety before performances and that kind of thing? That's getting a little bit more attention, or, reaction time, or there's so many of those other things. And I also wonder what you've observed about injuries. I've been able to use a metabolic cart in the past to test some of the professional soccer players in my city, and measure their metabolic rates and how they oxidize fat versus carbohydrates. And all of them had, generally speaking, much suppressed metabolic rates. So they weren't burning very many calories at a rested state. And the carbohydrate burn that these guys were burning at a rested state was super high. And my first thought was like, if you're burning through this many carbohydrates, what about injuries? Like, how is this going to impact your joints and your knees and all of that stuff? Like, is that something you notice that people, athletes on a ketogenic diet are more resistant to injury, or is that a bit of a stretch?
Look, I think I probably haven't seen enough athletes to go 100%. There definitely less injuries, so that would be a stretch. But what I do know is that when you are on the ketogenic diet or low carb / ketogenic diet, there's definitely an improvement in recovery from exercise. So there's less muscle soreness. There's an improvement in recovery, and that might lead to less injury over time. I don't know. That actually hasn't been looked at all. So I probably can't provide any half decent comment there. But I do think because of the theory that goes with high levels of oxidative stress that comes with high carbohydrate, you could say theoretically, potentially the immune system and the injury rate could be higher when there's more oxidative stress, but that hasn't been borne out in the literature just yet.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I would say anecdotally, maybe something that we would notice there, but yeah, if we don't have the research, hard to say definitively. You mentioned, introducing more carbohydrates, and you're absolutely right. Like for most athletes, there is a periodization of their program where some months they're training really hard, some months they're competing, some months they need to detrain, they need to take it easy and let their bodies fully recover. That matches really well with what we can do as far as nutrition and the timing of when we can put them on a stricter or more liberal kind of ketogenic diet. When you are adding in carbohydrates to somebody who is an athlete, especially in those glycolytic sports, like we said, what about timing in a day around their competition? I know that's something that you've looked at in the past in a research paper. How does that affect the athlete?
It's so interesting because there isn't, in the carbohydrate centric space, there are definitive guidelines about how much carbohydrate to have before, how much carbohydrate to have during exercise, and exactly how much carbohydrate, like 1 gram per kilogram body weight of carbohydrate for the recovery meal. So there's very definitive amounts to make you a high carb athlete. In the low carb or keto space, it's not there at all. It's just like, well, eat something that fits with your kind of food plan. So it's not about the amount of carbohydrate, but if you are going to bring back some carbohydrate, again, there's no research on this, but from an anecdotal perspective, it's very individual. Some athletes find that if you nutritionally support their training period or their training session beforehand, that can be a little bit helpful. That can be helpful. Some people feel during that can be helpful, and other people find that if you're having a smoothie, for example, as a recovery meal, if you lift the amount of carbohydrate in that, then that can potentially help how you feel in general over that next day for training. So essentially, it's a pre-exercise meal, but just the day before. So I would definitely say before, during, and after, and what that actually is really dependent on trial and error and working out with the athlete what works best for them. One thing that I am hot on is that when you introduce carbohydrates, they're good quality carbohydrates. You don't go, right, so have 65 jet planes, lollies after your thing and see how you go. It's bringing in some starchy vegetables, some fruit. Fruit is great to put in smoothies. And it might be for athletes during, in an endurance type sport, to bring in some half strength, sports drink or something if they don't react to it. So very, very trial and error, but you start with 20, 30, 40, 50 grams of carbohydrate and sort of work from there rather than just hit it back up to like 300 grams for the day.